Yo guys, Vision SJ here, bringing you more Marvel Rivals content. In today's video, I'll be bringing you Marvel Rivals guide and gameplay for Thor, the Son of Odin, following the latest Season 1.5 update, where I'll break down all of his abilities, including his team-ups, and addressing all of his strengths and weaknesses. This is episode 9 of my new Hero Series guide, with all of the previous episodes on my channel, and on that note, let's get right into it. So to begin with, his role and playstyle, he is a vanguard or a tank in this game, meaning he is designed to absorb damage, disrupt enemy lines, and creating space for his team. Now, unlike other tanks whose focus is heavily on protection and damage mitigation, Thor is a more unique and aggressive style tank who's capable at brawling and diving, utilizing his damage-based abilities, but also his mobility. Now, he thrives in the close to medium range combat, using Mjolnir to hit enemies and control the pace of a game. His abilities revolve heavily around his unique resource management called Thor Force, which is required for most of his abilities and grants him bonus health when using, which makes him a lot stronger and allows him to sustain really well in battle. Now, as I mentioned, for a tank, he's very mobile, but he does heavily rely on his Thor Force and managing this effectively, meaning you need to understand his cooldowns and how to utilize his abilities to stay in the fight in order to quickly regenerate his Thor Force. Now, if you pair him with the likes of Luna Snow or defensive tanks like Hulk, which these boost his survivability massively, so just bear that in mind when you're trying to think about how to use Thor and when and who to pair him with, because that will massively influence the impact he can have on a game. If he's solo tanking, there's just certain maps and modes where he's just not as effective, and that's purely based on where he thrives. If you use him on his own and you don't have anyone that's damage mitigating, your team is probably going to struggle. So I do often think he's best used in a 2-tank setup, and especially when you have a Luna who can use her secondary heal ability to keep him alive when needed, and then can focus primarily on a more damage mitigating tank like Doctor Strange. And then, of course, as for his strengths and weaknesses, like I mentioned, his strengths are his high damage output, his good mobility that he has, as well as his self-sustain, utilizing his Thor Force, and his ability to disrupt enemy backlines. Now, of course, as I mentioned as well, he is limited with range, as he has to rely on his Awakening Rune in order to deliver any sort of long-range damage, and also he is vulnerable if the Thor Force ability or his passive is not managed properly, so just bear that in mind, because he can be susceptible for interruptions and stuns, so just consider that when you're trying to play against characters who are capable at disrupting this character, like Winter Soldier. So I myself am a Thor main. I use him quite a lot in this game, and I've really enjoyed him, but what I've come to learn is characters like Mantis, believe it or not, or the Winter Soldier mainly, can actually cause you quite a few problems, because when you use your Thor Force ability, if you are in some way disrupted or stunned in any way, you are then left vulnerable and you cannot escape from situations using Mjolnir to fly away. Now, as for his abilities, he has a base health of 525, which is somewhat pretty balanced for the most part, considering he can regenerate a lot of health using his abilities. He has a movement speed of 6 meters per second, which is pretty standard across all of the heroes in the game. His primary attack, known as Mjolnir Bash, has a 4-meter range and deals 40 damage per hit. Now, this is mainly used to generate his Thor Force, as we have mentioned, and this is really effective at doing so in those close quarter engagements. As for his L2 ability, his Storm Surge, which is effectively his flying ability, by holding L2 allows you to spin Mjolnir before dashing forward and knocking back all enemies in your path. Enemies, bear in mind, if they are in their animation of an ability, such as Star-Lord, where he's spinning around, or other characters who are using abilities, some characters are immovable in this phase, so it won't work against them. But it also doesn't work against the Thing, who is immovable, so I have found in my own experience that Thor isn't as effective at slowing down the Thing, so if you come across him, may want to consider changing your style, or just changing character completely. Now, as for the charging distances, you need to hold down Mjolnir for 2 seconds using the L2 ability, which will allow you to travel up to a distance of 20 meters. However, if you don't charge it up, you just press the ability, you will travel to 10 meters. Now, it is worth also considering when you use this ability, you can obviously carry and move enemies as well. So when you are fully charged with this ability, you can move a player by up to 13 meters with a full charge, or you can move them up to 6 meters with a no charge. So just consider that when you're trying to displace enemies and trying to separate them from the group, because this is really crucial to understand. Now, the no charge also deals less damage. It deals 40 damage when it's not charged, and it deals 60 damage at maximum charge. And more importantly, it costs 1 Thor Force ability. So as you'll notice on all of these clips and in this gameplay, you'll see there are 3 hammer symbols on your screen. That is indicating how much Thor Force you have charged up. Now, as I mentioned, Storm Surge, the L2 ability, uses 1 every time you use this, so make sure you always have 1 left over for when you want to escape from situations when you're involved in all the chaos and brawling with other characters, which is really crucial to understand how to utilize this when you're diving on enemy players, especially those squishier targets such as strategists. When you're trying to get into the back line, deal damage, and then get back out, you need to combine this with his L1 ability, the Lightning Realm, which summons a lightning bubble that restores his Thor Force based on the number of enemy hits. It lasts 4 seconds and has a 5-meter radius. Now, this deals 40 damage when enemies cross into this bubble. It has a 12-second cooldown, and for any enemy that is affected by the spell area, 1 point of Thor Force is restored, or 1 hammer, and enemies that cross into the boundary will be slowed by 30% in their movement speed. So combining this with the likes of his Storm Surge ability, where you'll utilize this to charge into the action, and then place down the L1 ability to slow enemies, crowd controlling the situation, whilst also generating Thor Force, and then of course, relying on his Awakening Rune, his Square ability, where he consumes all of the Thor Force when you have fully charged or 3 hammers. You go into Awakened state, which grants him a massive bonus health and enhances the Mjolnir Bash and its damage output. Now, as I mentioned, it grants him a bonus health when using this ability, which lasts for about 2.5 seconds. The overall ability itself lasts for 5 seconds, and it does 70 damage on a projectile hit, and the spell field damage that's left behind after deals 15 damage per second. So the special effect of this ability is that it inflicts a damage over time on nearby enemies, also known as a dot ability, which basically is utilized to control crowded situations, which is really useful for creating space and allowing you to dictate the pace of a game as you are trying to divide and separate grouped up players, and then this is where he's most effective. And then of course his R1 ability, the hammer throw, allows him to poke and throw the hammer into situations where you're in that more medium range area where you're just trying to deal quick and easy damage and then back out. You throw Mjolnir forward, which then returns to you, and it travels at a speed of 60 meters per second when you initially throw it, and then returns to you at 8 meters per second. Now, this has a maximum range of 24 meters, only costing him 1 Thor Force, and then the outward projection damage, the initial launch of this, deals 70 damage, and then the returning damage deals 30. But I mainly use this ability to try and catch out those evasive characters who I deal damage to whilst brawling, and then when they try to escape, I use this to, as I mentioned, either track them down or poke enemies that are sitting at that more medium range area where I'm not committing to diving in as they're trying to either bait me in or isolate you. And you'll start to figure this out yourself when you play Thor. You'll figure out that enemy teams are playing more open or long range, where you're not as effective or able to be a problem for them, and this is where the R1 is quite useful as you're just trying to deal quick and easy damage. Now, as for his passive ability, where you consume Thor Force, as I mentioned, you gain bonus health, but when landing Mjolnir Bash, your primary attacks on enemies, you instantly recharge your Thor Force. Now, you can only generate a maximum of 3, as I've mentioned, but if you're not able to hit an enemy, it takes 5 seconds for each passive ability of the Thor Force to be active, so it effectively takes 15 seconds for your Thor Force to go from 0 to 3, and each point of Thor Force that you consume, so if you use just 1 hammer like the R1 ability, or you're using the L2 where you're trying to dash around, this will actually grant you a 100 bonus health, whilst the abilities that consume 3 Thor Force, which is basically the only one that does this, is the Awakening Rune, which is a square ability. This grants him with 200 bonus health, so just consider that when you're trying to maximize his sustain and stay alive in situations, because you want to try and combine all his abilities to try and constantly generate bonus health. Now, as for the ultimate ability, the God of Thunder, this costs 3,100 energy, which is surprisingly quite cheap to get and earn, and this deals 220 damage on the initial landing, where you effectively dive into the sky and then drop back down and deal a great amount of area damage in an 8-meter radius. Now, of course, as for his team abilities, he has the Odinson Reborn ability. When Hela lands a final hit and defeats an enemy, she instantly resurrects both Loki and Thor in the respawn phase, or if they're both still alive, grants them with bonus health. So that's really useful to consider when you're trying to form a team up. And then, of course, the Thunderous Deity, which is the second team up ability, where Thor infuses Thor Force into Storm and Captain America and grants them with this electrifying enhancement, and basically allows Storm to unleash Lightning Barrage, which is really useful for her to deal more damage. And then for Captain America, he gains a movement boost, and his shield is basically imbued with thunder power and electrocutes all nearby enemies to him. And it also grants them with a maximum bonus health of 100, which is actually really quite overpowered when you think about it. So pairing him with the likes of Captain America or Storm is definitely worth considering. And then as a summary of this character, Thor excels at diving into fights and bullying those more squishier targets like strategists or duelists, using his Thor force to be aggressive and then hitting enemies with Mjolnir Bash to keep his abilities and health sustained. And then essentially what you want to do is use the hammer throw ability to poke enemies from mid-range, use Storm Surge, which is his L2, to close the gap and distances between enemies, displacing other grouped enemies, and then also relying on his L1, his Lightning Realm, to slow down enemies, crowd controlling situations, and also recharging his Thor Force, and then using his primary to build up his Thor Force, consuming the Awakening Rune ability to allow him to deal an insane amount of damage. And there you have it. That's the full detailed guide on how to use Thor. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as it massively helps me out. If you have any cool tips and tricks that you've learned along the way with Thor, please let me know down below in the comments, and I'll be sure to get right back to you, because as I've mentioned, I'm a Thor main myself. I really enjoy using this character, which is why I wanted to go into a more of a detailed guide on this one, in comparison to my other videos on the channel for the Hero Series guide, because this character, I've learned a lot using him, and I thought there's quite a few details that people don't quite understand, and especially some tips and tricks on what you want to be doing as a Thor player yourself. Anyways, I'm Vision SGN, and I'll see you in the next one.